My name is Kayla Reed. I'm 31, an ER nurse, someone used to alarms and split-second decisions. But nothing prepared me for the call I got 3 days before Christmas, when my mother calmly told me not to come home. She said the holiday was about my sister's engagement this year, and that my presence would make things uncomfortable. I stood in my Chicago apartment, staring at a $480 train ticket I'd already bought, and realized I'd just been erased from my own family with one sentence. No argument, no explanation, just an empty seat decided without me. For the first time in my life, I stopped asking for permission to belong. I didn't go back to Indiana. I didn't call her again. I chose to walk away from tables where I had to shrink myself just to stay. That night, as I finished setting up dinner for people who had nowhere else to go, there was a knock on the hospital hallway door, slow and deliberate, like it wasn't an accident. If you want to know why I opened that door and what came after, you're welcome to stay with me. It all started with that phone call, and with the years before it that I never thought I'd say out loud. I didn't tell anyone at work what had happened. In the ER, silence can be a form of professionalism. You learn quickly that not every wound belongs on the surface. I kept my voice steady during handoff, charted like muscle memory, and moved through the unit with the same controlled pace I always used. But under that routine, something had shifted. It felt like a floorboard inside me had cracked. Not loudly, not enough for anyone else to hear, but enough that I could feel it with every step. I've always been good at functioning. That's what people like me learn to do early. When emotions are inconvenient, when timing is wrong, when there's no space for them, you fold them small and put them away. I learned that skill long before nursing school, long before Chicago, long before the ER taught me how to keep my hands steady while someone else fell apart in front of me. That first night after the call, I lay on my couch in my apartment, still in my scrubs, shoes kicked off but not put away. The Christmas lights across the street blinked on and off through my window. I watched them without really seeing them. What replayed instead was not my mother's voice, but the ease of it. The way she said it as if she were doing me a favor. The way she didn't ask how I felt, or if I could change shifts, or whether I wanted to talk. The decision had already been made. My role was simply to accept it. If you've ever felt that particular kind of quiet exclusion, the kind that arrives wrapped in calm logic, you'll understand why it doesn't feel dramatic in the moment. It feels administrative, like paperwork filed without your signature. I sat there for a long time before I realized my jaw hurt from how tightly I'd been holding it. I let myself breathe out slowly, once, and then again. Growing up in Indiana, I was the dependable one. That's how my family liked to frame it. Brianna was the emotional one, the expressive one, the one who needed support. I was the one who could handle things. That label followed me everywhere. When Brianna cried, I waited. When plans changed, I adjusted. When attention shifted, I stepped back. It wasn't that anyone ever said I didn't matter. They just didn't act like it did. I remember sitting at the kitchen table at 16, a letter from a scholarship committee spread open in front of me. My hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the kind of excitement that feels too big for your body. I wanted to show them. I wanted that moment where everyone looks at you and says, "We see you." Instead, my mother glanced up from her phone and said we'd talk about it later because Brianna was having a rough day. Later never came. The letter went into a drawer. I learned something then that I wouldn't have had words for at the time. Achievement was less important than harmony, and harmony meant not asking for space. That pattern followed me into adulthood. When I got into nursing school, there was a brief congratulation and then a reminder that tuition was expensive and I should be realistic. When I moved to Chicago, the distance was framed as my choice, my independence, my willingness to leave. Every step forward was subtly reframed as something I'd done alone, rather than something worth showing up for. After the call, my phone stayed face down on the coffee table. I didn't want to see it light up. I didn't want to check messages that weren't there. I made pasta without appetite and ate standing up. I washed the plate immediately, as if leaving it in the sink would be some kind of failure. These small rituals of control were familiar. They made me feel functional when I didn't feel whole. The next morning, I went to work early. The hospital was quieter at that hour, the kind of quiet that carries anticipation rather than peace. I changed into fresh scrubs and tied my hair back with the same elastic I always used. In the locker room mirror, I looked exactly like myself. That was unsettling. I'd expected to see something different, some visible sign that things had changed. During a lull in the shift, I found myself standing near the nurse's station, staring at the board without absorbing any of it. My coworker, Lena, bumped my shoulder lightly and asked if I was okay. I nodded automatically. The word yes came out clean and practiced. It wasn't a lie in the way people think lies are. It was just incomplete. There's a strange dissonance that happens when your internal world is loud and your external one demands calm. I took vitals. I reassured a patient who was afraid of a procedure I'd seen hundreds of times. I explained things gently, thoroughly, the way I always did. Somewhere in the middle of that, it occurred to me that I was very good at caring for people who were scared and very bad at admitting when I was. When my break finally came, I sat alone in the staff room with a cup of coffee I didn't finish. My phone buzzed once. It was a group text from my family, already active, full of heart emojis and references to catering options and colors. I wasn't included. I stared at the screen longer than I should have, then turned the phone face down again. I didn't cry then. That came later. What I felt first was a kind of dull clarity. Not relief, not anger, just understanding. This wasn't temporary. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was the structure I'd been living inside for years, made visible. That evening, after my shift ended, I walked home instead of taking the train. The air was cold enough to sting my lungs. Chicago in December doesn't ask how you're doing. It moves forward regardless. I liked that about it. The city didn't expect anything from me except presence. As I walked, I made a decision that didn't feel dramatic in the moment. It felt practical. I wasn't going to spend Christmas alone in my apartment pretending that was fine. I also wasn't going to force my way into a place where I wasn't wanted. There was a third option, one I'd never considered before, because it hadn't seemed allowed. The idea came quietly. I thought about coworkers who worked holidays because they didn't have families nearby. I thought about patients who talked about empty houses and long nights. I thought about the way food changes when it's shared. The thought settled in my chest and stayed there. If this story feels close to something you've lived, you're welcome to stay with me as I untangle it, piece by piece, at whatever pace feels right to you. I spent the next day between shifts planning something I'd never planned before without checking with anyone. I made a list. Not a neat one, just names that came to mind. Lena, 2 residents who always volunteered for holidays, a tech who once mentioned she'd moved from out of state and didn't know anyone yet. I didn't overthink it. I sent messages that were simple and open. No pressure, just an invitation. There was a strange calm in doing that, a steadiness I hadn't felt in days. It wasn't happiness, it was alignment. For once, my actions matched what I needed instead of what was expected. As Christmas Eve approached, the hospital took on that peculiar mix of stress and softness. Decorations taped to walls, a volunteer choir singing slightly off-key near the entrance, families coming and going with bags of food and forced cheer. I watched all of it with a kind of detached curiosity, like someone observing a ritual from the outside. That night, after my shift, I set up a small table in an unused conference room near the ER. It wasn't festive. It didn't need to be. Paper plates, takeout containers, the smell of warm food filling a sterile space. One by one, people arrived. Some with smiles, some hesitant, some visibly relieved. We didn't talk about families at first. We talked about work, about patients, about nothing in particular. At some point, I realized I was breathing more easily than I had in days. My shoulders had dropped. My hands weren't clenched. This wasn't a replacement. It wasn't a performance. It was simply a moment of shared presence. Later, after most people had left, I stayed behind to clean up. I wiped down the table slowly, not because it needed it, but because I wasn't ready to leave yet. The hallway outside was quiet. The lights dimmed for night mode. That's when I heard the knock. It wasn't loud. It wasn't urgent. Just a steady tap against the open door frame. I looked up, expecting one of the doctors who'd forgotten something. Instead, there was an older woman standing there, coat still on, hands clasped in front of her. She looked uncertain, but not lost. She asked if she could come in. Her voice was gentle. I said yes before thinking about it. What followed didn't feel like the start of something significant at the time. It felt like a small interruption, a conversation, a pause. I couldn't have known then how much weight that moment would eventually carry. I only knew that as she stepped into the room, something in the air shifted again, quieter this time, but no less real. She introduced herself, simply, without titles or explanations, as if names were enough. Her coat was too thin for the weather, a wool gray that had softened with age. I noticed small details the way nurses do. The slight stiffness in her shoulders, the careful way she shifted her weight, as if standing for too long wasn't comfortable. She asked if the food was for staff, then hesitated, and added that she didn't mean to intrude. Her apology came automatically, like a reflex she'd practiced. I told her it was for anyone who needed it. The words surprised me as they came out of my mouth. Anyone who needed it. I hadn't realized how much that included until I saw her relax just a fraction, like she'd been holding herself together with invisible effort. She stepped farther into the room, rubbing her hands together for warmth. I poured her a cup of hot chocolate without asking. She smiled at that, a small, grateful smile that didn't demand anything from me. We didn't sit right away. She stood near the table, looking at the half-empty containers, the paper plates stacked unevenly. She said it smelled good. She said she hadn't expected to find anything open this late. I asked if she'd been visiting someone. She nodded, then shook her head, then shrugged as if the answer was complicated. Her husband, she said. He'd been gone a year. She still came by the hospital sometimes, she admitted. Not because she needed to, but because it felt quieter here than her apartment on holidays. There was no drama in the way she said it, no tremor, just fact. I recognized that tone. It was the same one I used when describing things that hurt too much to embellish. I offered her a chair. She sat slowly, carefully, and wrapped her hands around the cup I'd given her. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence wasn't awkward. It felt like a shared agreement not to rush. She asked me my name. I told her. She repeated it once, softly, like she was testing how it sounded. Then she asked if I was working the holiday by choice or necessity. The question was gentle, but it landed somewhere tender. I told her I'd volunteered, that it made sense this year. I didn't explain further. She didn't ask. Instead, she told me about the building where she lived, an old place with long hallways and drafty windows, mostly older residents now, people who nodded politely but rarely spoke. She said there was a dining room on the first floor that used to be lively, potlucks, card games. Over time, fewer people came. Someone stopped organizing. The tables stayed folded against the wall. She said it with a kind of mild curiosity, like she was observing a natural process rather than a loss. As she talked, I felt something in me slow down. The part that always anticipates, that listens for what's required next. I wasn't needed in the way I was used to being needed. She wasn't asking me to fix anything. She was just telling me what her days looked like. That felt new. When she finished her food, she thanked me again, more formally this time, and said she should go. I felt an unexpected pull at the thought of her leaving. Not panic, not loneliness, just a sense that the room would change once she did. I asked if she lived nearby. She said yes, a few blocks east. Then, almost as an afterthought, she mentioned that a group of residents in her building sometimes had dinner together on Sundays. Not regularly, she added, only when someone remembered to suggest it. She smiled then, a little wry. She said I was welcome to join, if I wanted. The invitation hung there, light but real. I felt the old reflex rise, the instinct to minimize, to say thank you and decline so I wouldn't impose. It surprised me how quickly that instinct surfaced, like muscle memory. Before I could stop myself, I almost did it. Then I thought about the group text I'd sent the day before. The way it had felt to invite without knowing the answer. I thought about the decision I'd made while walking home in the cold, the third option. I said I might like that. The words felt careful, but honest. She nodded, as if that was enough. She wrote her address on a scrap of paper, her handwriting neat but slightly shaky. She told me her name again, slower this time. I folded the paper and put it in my pocket, not trusting myself to say more. After she left, I stayed in the conference room for a while longer. I sat in one of the chairs she'd used and looked at the empty cup she'd left behind. The room felt quieter than before, but not hollow. I cleaned up eventually, stacking plates, tying up trash bags. When I stepped back into the hallway, the hum of the hospital wrapped around me again. Familiar, insistent. I walked home under a sky that felt heavy with snow, my breath fogging the air in front of me. At home, I kicked off my shoes and leaned against the door longer than necessary. My apartment smelled faintly of the pasta I'd made and not eaten. I didn't turn on the TV. I didn't check my phone. I went straight to bed and slept deeply, without dreams. The next few days passed in a blur of shifts and errands. Christmas itself came and went quietly. I worked a double shift, exchanged small gifts with coworkers, accepted hugs that were warm but brief. When I finally got home late that night, I felt tired in a clean way, the kind that comes from effort rather than strain. I heated up leftovers and ate them sitting on the floor, back against the couch. It felt oddly satisfying. The paper with the address stayed in my jacket pocket. I touched it absent-mindedly sometimes, as if to reassure myself it was still there. I didn't decide right away whether I'd go. Part of me worried it would feel awkward, that I wouldn't fit, that I'd sit there politely and leave early, carrying the weight of yet another almost connection. I'd had enough of those to last a lifetime. Work resumed its usual pace after the holidays. The decorations came down, the volunteer choir disappeared. The hospital returned to its standard palette of white and gray. On one of my days off, a Sunday, I found myself standing in my kitchen, staring at the clock. It was just past 4. The address was only a few blocks away. I told myself I could walk by, just to see the building, no obligation. I put on my coat and went out. The wind had softened. The sidewalks were wet with melted snow. The building was exactly as she'd described it. Brick, narrow windows, a small sign by the door that looked older than I was. I stood across the street for a moment, pretending to check my phone. I could turn back. No one would know. I thought about the word welcome, how rarely I'd felt it without conditions. I crossed the street. Inside, the hallway smelled faintly of cleaning solution and something warm, maybe soup. I followed the sound of voices down to a common room at the end. The door was open. A few tables had been set up. Not many people, maybe 6 or 7. Some were talking, some were quiet. She saw me first and smiled, her face lighting in a way that felt disproportionate to how little we knew each other. She waved me in. Introductions were made, slowly. Names repeated, chairs offered. Someone asked what I did for work. Someone else asked if I liked cats. It was mundane, comfortably so. I realized I'd been bracing myself for something more intense, some emotional exchange that would require careful navigation. Instead, there was just food being passed and small talk that didn't probe too deeply. I noticed how different this felt from family gatherings I'd known. There was no unspoken hierarchy. No one dominated the conversation. No one watched the clock for permission to leave. People talked when they had something to say and listened when they didn't. I felt my body respond to that ease before my mind caught up. My shoulders loosened. My voice settled into a natural register. As the weeks went on, I started going more regularly. Not every Sunday. Some shifts conflicted. Some days I was too tired. But often enough that faces became familiar. Stories layered, preferences noted. I learned who liked extra salt, who needed help carrying plates, who told the same story more than once. I found myself looking forward to it in a way that felt almost suspicious, like I was waiting for the catch. It didn't come. What came instead was a gradual recalibration. My sense of what was normal began to shift. I stopped scanning rooms for signs that I was overstaying. I stopped preparing explanations in advance. I let myself sit in silence without filling it. That, more than anything, felt revolutionary. There was a man who started coming a few weeks after I did. He arrived late the first time, breathless, apologetic. He wore a jacket with reflective stripes and had the posture of someone used to moving quickly. He introduced himself with a brief smile and took the first empty seat he found. We didn't speak much that night. Later, I learned he worked as a paramedic, that he often came straight from shifts, that he didn't like to talk about work unless asked directly. Our conversations unfolded slowly, a comment here, a shared look there. Nothing forced, nothing rushed. I appreciated that. I appreciated that he didn't ask why I wasn't with my family on Sundays. I appreciated that when he laughed, it wasn't loud, but it was real. Over time, we began to talk more, sometimes lingering after others had left. Not about big things, about books, about food, about the city. I didn't think of him as anything in particular at first. He was just part of the room, part of the rhythm. It wasn't until one evening, when he noticed I'd been quiet and asked if I was okay, that something shifted. Not because of the question, but because of the way he waited for the answer. No rush, no assumption. I told him I was tired. It was true. He nodded and said, "That made sense." That was it. No fixing, no reframing. The simplicity of that response stayed with me longer than it should have. Meanwhile, my family remained absent. The group text continued without me. Photos were posted, plans made. I didn't block anyone. I didn't confront anyone. I just let the distance exist. Some days it hurt. Some days it didn't. The pain became less sharp, more like an old bruise that flares under pressure. What surprised me most was the guilt. Not for staying away, but for feeling better. There were moments when I caught myself smiling on a Sunday afternoon and felt a reflexive tightening in my chest, like I was doing something wrong, like happiness required justification. I worked through that slowly, sometimes in the quiet moments before sleep, sometimes on long walks through the neighborhood. I reminded myself that relief wasn't betrayal. I began to notice how often I'd been preparing to be dismissed, how deeply that expectation had settled into my posture, my tone, my choices. Being in a space where that didn't happen felt disorienting at first, like learning to walk on a surface that didn't give way. One night, after dinner, the older woman who'd first invited me pulled me aside. She asked how work was going. I told her about a particularly difficult shift. She listened, nodding, asking thoughtful questions. At the end, she said she was glad I was there, that the room felt different with me in it. The words landed softly but firmly. I didn't deflect them. I let them stay. On my walk home that night, the city felt quieter than usual. Not empty, just settled. I realized I hadn't thought about my family all evening. The realization startled me more than the call had weeks earlier. It wasn't that they didn't matter, it was that, for once, they weren't the axis everything turned on. As winter gave way to early spring, something in me continued to adjust. I started sleeping better. I laughed more easily. I noticed details again: the color of the sky at dusk, the smell of bread from a bakery down the block. I didn't attribute these changes to any one thing. They felt cumulative, like the result of 1,000 small permissions I'd never granted myself before. I didn't know then where any of this was leading. I wasn't looking for resolution or redemption. I was just inhabiting my life more fully than I had in years. That, I would later realize, was the real beginning of everything that followed. The first sign that the distance wouldn't remain quiet came on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. I was between shifts, standing in line at a grocery store with a basket I hadn't planned to fill, when my phone buzzed with a name I hadn't seen light up my screen in weeks. My sister. The vibration felt louder than it should have. I didn't answer. I paid, walked out, loaded my bags into the trunk, and sat there with my hands on the steering wheel until the second call went to voicemail. I listened to it later at home, with the groceries still on the counter. Her voice was bright, practiced, the way it got when she was delivering news she expected to be celebrated. She talked about dates and venues and how everything was happening so fast. She said Mom was overwhelmed but happy. She said she assumed I'd heard by now. At the end, almost casually, she added that it would mean a lot to have me there when things became official. No apology, no acknowledgement of the silence, just an expectation sliding neatly into place. I didn't call her back. I didn't text. I sat on the floor and let the message replay once more, then deleted it. The quiet that followed was heavier than before. Not painful exactly, pressurized, like something had been set in motion whether I participated or not. At work the next day, the ER was relentless. Trauma after trauma, bodies arriving faster than beds freed up. I moved through it all with a focus that surprised even me. When things got loud, my mind narrowed. There was comfort in the clarity of that. Do this. Say this. Move here. No ambiguity, no emotional subtext. But in the quieter moments, it crept back in. The feeling that I was being pulled in two directions, the old gravity and the new one. I noticed how easily the past still reached for me, even when I wasn't looking. How quickly I defaulted to wondering what I should do rather than what I wanted. That Sunday, dinner felt different. The room was fuller than usual. A birthday was being celebrated. Someone had brought a cake that leaned slightly to one side. Laughter bounced off the walls. I found myself sitting next to the man with the reflective jacket again. We talked about nothing for a while. Then, without looking at me directly, he asked if everything was okay. Not because I'd said anything, because he'd noticed. I told him about the voicemail. Not all of it, just enough. He listened, nodding slowly, his expression thoughtful. When I finished, he didn't offer advice. He didn't say family was complicated or that I should give them another chance. He said, "That sounds like a lot to carry alone." The simplicity of it caught me off guard. I felt my throat tighten, not from sadness, but from recognition. The older woman who had first invited me sat across the table, watching quietly. Later, when most people had left and the room had thinned out, she poured us each a cup of tea and asked how I was really doing. The question landed differently coming from her. I told her I felt like I was standing at the edge of something I didn't know how to navigate. She nodded, as if that made sense. She told me that when her husband died, people expected her grief to follow a certain timeline, to soften, to become more manageable. When it didn't, she learned to let go of other people's expectations instead. "You don't owe anyone access to you," she said gently. "Not even the people who raised you." The words stayed with me long after I went home. Over the next few weeks, the messages increased. A text from my mother asking why I hadn't responded. Another from my sister, less cheerful this time, asking if I was upset. A voicemail that carried a hint of frustration. I didn't respond to any of them. Each message felt like a test I was expected to pass by returning to my place. I was aware of how that might look from the outside, how silence can be interpreted as cruelty. But inside, it felt like preservation. The guilt flared again, sharper now. I questioned myself late at night, replaying conversations, searching for the line where boundary becomes rejection. I wondered if I was being unfair, if I was overreacting. Those questions felt familiar, well-worn. I recognized them as the same ones that had kept me quiet for years. One night, after a particularly long shift, I found myself sitting on the edge of my bed, phone in hand, hovering over my mother's contact. I imagined calling her. I imagined explaining everything calmly, clearly, the way I always did. I imagined her listening. I imagined the relief of being understood. Then I imagined the more likely outcome, the minimization, the reframing, the reminder that things were stressful for everyone. I set the phone down. The tension reached its peak when an envelope arrived in my mailbox with my parents' return address. I stared at it for a long time before opening it. Inside was an invitation, thick paper, embossed lettering, my sister's engagement announcement. My name printed alongside the rest of the family, as if nothing had happened, as if inclusion could be restored with stationery. Something in me snapped, Not loudly, but decisively. I felt a heat rise in my chest, followed by a steadiness I hadn't expected. This wasn't confusion anymore. This was clarity. They weren't reaching out to repair anything. They were reaching out to maintain appearances. If you're listening to this, and you've ever stood at that same edge, wondering whether to step back into a role that hurts because it's familiar, you don't have to decide right now. Sometimes it helps just to stay and listen, to let the truth of your own reaction speak before you do. I didn't tear up the invitation. I didn't throw it away. I placed it on my kitchen table and looked at it like evidence. Proof of how little had changed. Proof of how much I had. That evening, I went for a walk. The city was alive in that particular way it gets in early spring, the air still cold but no longer hostile. I walked without a destination, letting my thoughts move freely for the first time in days. I realized I wasn't angry at my family. Not really. I was grieving something I'd finally admitted I wasn't going to have. At dinner the following Sunday, I brought it up. Not dramatically, just matter-of-factly. I told the group that my family was reaching out again and that I didn't know how to respond. No one rushed in. No one interrupted. They listened. One person shared a story of going no contact with a sibling. Another talked about reconciliation that came with clear boundaries. No one told me what to do. The room held the uncertainty without trying to resolve it. Afterward, the man with the reflective jacket walked me home. We didn't talk much. At my door, he paused, hands in his pockets, and said that whatever I decided, it didn't change how he saw me. It was such a simple statement, but it landed with unexpected force. I thanked him. I watched him walk away, his figure disappearing into the streetlights. The next day, my mother called again. This time, I answered. My heart pounded as I held the phone to my ear. Her voice was tight, controlled. She asked why I hadn't responded to the invitation. I told her calmly that I wasn't coming. There was a pause, then a familiar shift. She said she didn't understand why I was making things difficult. She said my sister was hurt. She said families show up for each other. I listened without interrupting. When she finished, I said something I'd never said before. I told her that showing up also meant being welcome, that it meant making space, that I wasn't going to keep pretending everything was fine when it wasn't. My voice shook, but I didn't back down. She told me I was being selfish, that I was holding on to the past, that I needed to let things go. I felt the old urge to explain myself more clearly, to soften my words so they'd be easier to accept. Instead, I told her I needed some time. I told her I wouldn't be attending any events for the foreseeable future. Then I ended the call. The aftermath was immediate and intense. Messages from extended family, questions that felt like accusations, explanations demanded. I didn't respond to those either. I muted threads. I protected my quiet. Each small act felt like a muscle being used for the first time, weak, but strengthening. The emotional peak didn't come with shouting or tears. It came one evening when I sat alone in my apartment, the engagement invitation still on the table, and realized I didn't feel compelled to act. I didn't need to prove anything. I didn't need to justify my absence. The relief that followed was so sudden, it brought tears to my eyes. That was the moment I understood that the real conflict wasn't with my family. It was with the version of myself that believed love had to be earned through endurance. Letting go of that belief hurt more than any arguments ever had. But it also felt like setting down something I'd been carrying for far too long. As spring moved forward, the intensity began to shift. The storm passed, leaving behind a landscape that was unfamiliar but navigable. I still thought about my family. I still missed them in abstract ways. But the ache was no longer the center of my days. Something else was taking shape, slowly, deliberately, a sense of agency I hadn't known before. I didn't rush to name it. I just noticed it. In the way I made plans without checking first. In the way I spoke about my life without disclaimers. In the way I stopped waiting for permission to take up space. I didn't know then that this clarity would lead to another kind of turning, one that would ask me not just to walk away, but to choose forward. At the time, all I knew was that the ground beneath me felt solid for the first time in a long while. Now, when I look back on that time, my life feels different in a very quiet way. I'm still an ER nurse. I still work long, intense shifts. But when I leave the hospital, I no longer carry the feeling that I have to brace myself just to get through the day. My life has its own rhythm now. I cook more slowly. I sleep more deeply. I don't tense up every time my phone buzzes. Sunday dinners still happen, sometimes with a full table, sometimes with just a few people. But there is always laughter and real presence. I don't call this a replacement family. I call it chosen connection. Relationships I stepped into freely and was welcomed into in return. Most of all, I feel steady inside. Not because everything is perfect, but because I've stopped fighting myself. What this experience taught me is that the value of a life isn't measured by how much we can endure, but by how honestly we allow ourselves to live. Some relationships last a long time, but that doesn't automatically make them healthy. Some roles feel familiar, but familiar doesn't always mean right. When we stop maintaining peace by shrinking ourselves, we don't become selfish. We become truthful about our needs. And that truth, even when it's uncomfortable at first, is what creates real peace over time. If you're listening to this and parts of it feel uncomfortably close to home, I want you to hear this clearly. You are not weak because you're tired. You are not wrong for needing distance. There are pains that aren't loud or dramatic, but they slowly wear us down when we keep ignoring them. You are allowed to stop. You are allowed to choose silence if that's what keeps you safe. You are allowed to build a life where you don't have to ask permission to be yourself. Feeling lighter after letting something go doesn't make you ungrateful. It simply means you're healing. I don't know where your path will lead, just as I didn't know what was ahead of me when I first stepped away from the version of myself I had outgrown. But I do know this. When you start listening to yourself with honesty, life responds. Not with drama or instant answers, but with small, steady changes that last. And if you want to stay a little longer, if you're curious about what came next for me and the lessons I'm still learning along the way, you're welcome to keep listening. This story isn't over. It's simply moving into another chapter, one that's quieter but deeper.